It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Belfast and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. This week, it's been a long time coming. Boris Johnson unveils a plan for health and social care.
This is the right, the reasonable and the fair approach, making sure people get the care and treatment they need in the right place at the right time.
And MPs are asked to vote immediately on a big tax hike to pay for it.
We will never outbid the Labour Party in the arms race of an NHS tax.
This is nowhere near enough money. It hasn't been ring-fenced for social care, and low-paid workers are funding it.
In Scotland, a new government is formed. Nicola Sturgeon tells MSPs what it will do.
The case for independence is a strong one, and we will present it openly, frankly and with confidence and ambition.
The Northern Ireland Assembly is recalled over fears of COVID in schools.
The North of Ireland is the only jurisdiction where schools were required to do the contact tracing. Why was that, Minister?
All that coming up, but let's start with that big announcement on health and social care. Sean, it's been long anticipated. Take us through it.
This was a big political and parliamentary moment. Governments for years have been grappling with problems to do with adult social care in England. That's the help people get with day-to-day tasks like washing and cleaning. It's not just older people who get this help, it's also other vulnerable people of working age. Now, the questions have been about the quality of care, whether everybody who needs help gets it. But also there's been a really big question about how it's paid for, and lots of families have complained that they've had to sell family homes in order to pay for care. Boris Johnson, when he became Prime Minister, said on the steps of Downing Street that he had a plan to fix it. Well, 2 years on, he told a packed House of Commons about his plans to raise taxes, not just to tackle the problem in social care, but also to clear the backlog in the NHS caused by COVID.
From next April, we will create a new UK-wide 1.25% health and social care levy on earned income hypothecated in law to health and social care, with dividend rates increasing by the same amount. This will raise almost £36 billion over the next 3 years, with money from the levy going directly to health and social care across the whole of our United Kingdom. No Conservative government, Mr. Speaker, ever wants to raise taxes, and I will be honest with the House, I accept that this breaks a manifesto commitment, which is not something I do lightly, but a global pandemic was in no one's manifesto, Mr. Speaker.
This is a tax rise that breaks a promise that the Prime Minister made at the last election. A promise that they all made at the last election, every single one of them. A tax rise on young people, supermarket workers and nurses. A tax rise, Mr. Speaker, that means a landlord renting out dozens of properties won't pay a penny more, but the tenants working in full-time jobs would. A tax rise that places another burden on business just as they're trying to get back on their feet. Mr. Speaker, read my lips. The Tories can never again claim to be the party of low tax.
The unfairness of this tax hike will be especially felt in Scotland. The Scottish Government is responsible for social care and already funds provisions from existing budgets and tax receipts, including SNP policies such as free personal and nursing care. Mr. Speaker, we have done it. And as the Prime Minister well knows, by raising this levy across the UK, the Tories are taxing Scottish workers twice and forcing them to pay the bill for social care in England as well as at home in Scotland. This is the Prime Minister's poll tax on Scottish workers to pay for English social care.
Now, it's worth mentioning at this point, of course, Sean, that it is a UK-wide tax rise, but it is to reform a policy on social care focused mainly in England. Now, it's not surprising that the Labour leader Keir Starmer, of course, has criticised the plans and the way that they're going to be paid for. But what was perhaps notable were the misgivings that were really represented by members of the Conservative Party and on the Conservative benches about breaking the manifesto and about increasing taxes. How did it all sort of end?
You're right. This is a controversial policy. We should say Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will get to share over £2 billion a year under these plans.
Yes.
Boris Johnson was keen to stress that in the Commons. But in the days leading up to the announcement, there'd been no shortage of former ministers and Conservative MPs criticising the plans. They didn't like the idea of breaking another election promise. They certainly didn't like the idea of the Conservatives being seen as a party that increased taxes. And many of them had concerns about the idea that most of this money would be raised by increasing national insurance contributions. They thought that was an unfair way of doing it. But when we came to that big announcement, the criticism from the Conservatives was muted. And as we'll see, there was only really one Conservative MP who directly challenged the Prime Minister.
Raising taxes is an incredibly difficult thing for any Conservative government to do. So can I thank the Prime Minister for biting the bullet on this intractable issue that I and many former health secretaries have wrestled with? Does he agree that the demographic challenge, which I know he's personally trying to address with a bit of population growth in Downing Street, does he agree that that challenge means that whether you pay insurance in America, social insurance in Germany or taxes in the UK, everyone is going to pay more for their health and care, and any government has a responsibility to make sure that resources are allocated where the electorate's priorities are, and in this country it is health and social care.
Today he has chosen what I consider to be the least progressive option to fix both our health and social care system. It's unfair between generations, it's unfair between individuals, and it's unfair between those who derive their income from assets or from work. He's ignoring a raft of better alternatives, raising income tax, dividend tax being equivalent to income tax or capital gains tax. Why?
I think that most people recognise that if we want more services, then we've got to pay more. But if we're going to pay, at least it should be fair. And despite your claim that this is a progressive tax, it is not. It is a flat rate tax, the benefit of which will go mostly to better off people. And therefore, those who are less well off will be subsidising those who are better off. And of course, young people and employers at a time when we're trying to create more jobs are going to feel the impact.
A little over 2 years ago, the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street and promised the nation an oven-ready deal on social care. Yet today's announcement of a tax on jobs only promises a plan later this year, and crucially, the detail here says only people starting care after October 2023 will be helped with those catastrophic costs. So what does the Prime Minister say today to the 1.5 million people who are missing out on care and to the millions of hard-working families facing crippling costs between now and September 2023 but paying for it from April next year?
As Conservatives, broken pledges and tax rises should concern us. Our finances are in a perilous state. Surely a radical review of the NHS is needed if this money is not going to disappear into another black hole. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the Conservative way to raise revenue is to lower taxes, not raise them?
Well, a flavour of that debate, Sean. And MPs weren't really given much time, were they, to take it in and the detail that was available before they were asked to vote on it all?
That's right. As soon as Boris Johnson's statement was over, we had the announcement that there would be a debate and a big vote on Wednesday. MPs were being asked to approve in principle this increase in national insurance contributions straight away. And so, of course, we had this debate. We saw more of the concerns from Conservatives being expressed then. But in the end, the government won the vote comfortably, and only 5 Conservatives actively voted against. They voted with Labour. A number of Conservatives abstained, but it was not as close a vote as some might have predicted, particularly if they'd been reading the newspapers at the weekend before this big announcement.
This measure serves to redeem a promise and to discharge an obligation. It is a profoundly conservative thing to do, to provide for future generations without taxing, without increasing our borrowing, without increasing spending, and in a way that is sustainable and which grips a nettle that for too many years has been ignored by the party opposite. And with that in mind, I commend this motion to the House.
Social care is a huge challenge, and there are other challenges coming too. We need to do things differently. Labour's test is simple. Does it fix the problem, and does it do it in a fair way? The answer to both of these questions is no, and that is why Labour will vote against this unfair, job-taxing, manifesto-shredding tax bombshell this evening.
Listening to the opposition, it seems to me as if the global pandemic never occurred, as if the economy never shrank by the greatest level since 1709 and the Great Frost of that year, as if millions of jobs were never imperilled, as if this government never had to step in fiscally in a way that probably no government outside wartime has ever had to do, and with such positive effects.
If you create an NHS tax, you have an NHS tax forever. It will never go down. It can only go up. No party is ever going to stand at an election saying, I've got a good idea. Vote for me, I'll cut the NHS tax. It is fundamentally unconservative, and in the long term, it will massively damage the prospects of our party, because we will never outbid the Labour Party in the arms race of an NHS tax.
You'd struggle to design a more unfair and economically illiterate social care policy if you tried. Less than one in every £6 of the money raised will go to social care in the first 3 years of the plan. It's a triple whammy that the government's presenting us with today. This is nowhere near enough money, it hasn't been ring-fenced for social care, and low-paid workers are funding it.
Sean, we'll come back to you a little bit later on in the programme, but let's talk about some of the developments that have been unfolding in Holyrood with our correspondent David Wallace-Lockhart. David, Nicola Sturgeon has been outlining her programme for government and, unsurprisingly, independence is very much on the agenda.
That's right, Joe. So, programme for government this week in Holyrood, which is essentially the Holyrood equivalent of a Queen's speech outlining legislative plans for the year ahead. Slightly delayed this year due to talks between the SNP and the Scottish Greens forming their power-sharing government. Now, we'll get to all the bills that were outlined in the programme for government in a moment, but first, independence. Very quickly, in her statement to the Chamber, Nicola Sturgeon announcing that plans for a second independence referendum are to restart. Now, for context, when the pandemic hit last year, the Scottish Government paused planning for another independence referendum, but Nicola Sturgeon using the programme for government as an opportunity to announce that that planning will now restart. Our democratic mandate to allow people to decide the country's future is beyond question. And at this juncture in history, it is essential that we consider the kind of country we want to be and how best to secure it. As we emerge from the pandemic, choices fall to be made that will shape our economy and our society for decades to come. Which Parliament, Westminster or Holyrood, should make these choices? And what principles will they be guided by? These are questions which cannot be avoided nor postponed until the die is already cast. So we intend to offer the choice. We will do so only when the COVID crisis has passed, but our aim, COVID permitting, is that it will be in the first half of this Parliament before the end of 2023. And crucially, we will ensure that the choice, when it does come, is a fully informed one. To that end, I can confirm that the Scottish Government will now restart work on the detailed prospectus that will guide the decision. Presiding Officer, the case for independence is a strong one, and we will present it openly, frankly
and with confidence and ambition.
Nicola Sturgeon has put independence above Scottish jobs. Separating Scotland is the top priority for her government, not our recovery. Their focus is on a referendum, not the future of Scotland getting through this pandemic. This government should be pouring every single bit of time and effort into our economy, into tackling drug deaths and into remobilising our NHS. But no, they put independence at the forefront again. Instead, the government will start work on a detailed prospectus for an independent Scotland, taking time and resources away from the priorities that they should be focusing on to another independence referendum. Nicola Sturgeon is giving us a new white paper on independence instead of a plan for jobs, instead of a plan to tackle drug deaths, and instead of a plan for our NHS recovery.
So Nicola Sturgeon wants a second independence referendum, but the process for securing it remains a bit unclear. In 2014, both the Scottish and UK governments agreed that a referendum should happen. At this point, there's no UK government agreement that a second one should take place. It's possible this will yet all end up in the courts.
Right, well, David, that is the debate around independence. What about the government's plans in other areas of the domestic agenda?
Yeah, in the statement there was a lot of content that had nothing to do with independence. So the Scottish Government, as part of the programme for government, wants to extend free childcare, specifically to Scots on lower incomes. There are plans for a bill to create a national care service to be brought forward in the first year of this Parliament. And Nicola Sturgeon said this will arguably be the most significant public service reform since the creation of the NHS. Not all opposition parties agree with that, which we'll see in a moment. There are also plans to bring forward a gender reform bill. This would make it easier for someone in Scotland to change their legally recognised gender. Now, that's proving controversial within Nicola Sturgeon's own party, but she stressed as part of her statement that it would not remove any legal protections that women currently have, but also be a bill to pardon minors convicted of certain offences during the strikes in the 80s, and a bill that will make it easier for people to get compensation if they have to self-isolate due to coronavirus. Nicola Sturgeon saying all of this will help to shape a better future for Scotland.
As we begin our recovery from the pandemic, the year ahead will be particularly crucial. In the face of the challenges we face, our ambition must be and is bold. This programme sets out clear plans to lead Scotland out of the greatest health crisis in a century and transform our nation and the lives of all those who live here. We will deliver a national care service. We will double the Scottish Child Payment, and we will invest in affordable, energy-efficient homes and green travel. We will ensure that businesses have the support and people the skills to succeed in the low-carbon economy of the future. We will show global leadership in tackling the climate crisis, and we will offer people an informed choice on Scotland's future. This programme addresses our current reality, but it also looks forward with confidence and ambition to a brighter future.
This programme for government doesn't go far enough. Presiding Officer, barely a week goes by without someone from the government's front benches declaring something mundane, rebadged or self-serving as historic. But the dire truth is, despite the SNP's rhetoric, the only historic thing today is levels of poverty in our streets, the numbers waiting for treatment in our hospitals, and the depth of the economic crisis facing our country. In the face of those challenges, this is a tired and rehashed programme from a party that's clearly run out of big ideas. This disappointing programme for government shows that there is a lack of ambition from this SNP government. Seriously, is that it? Is that as good as it gets? Is that the scale of ambition for this country? I don't think so.
The experience of botched, rushed centralisation of the police in Scotland is one of the many reasons that we in the Liberal Democrats are so worried about the planned ministerial takeover of social care. In today's statement, we see some further detail about those proposals for a national care service, but that term itself is deceiving. The First Minister has many talents, but she is not some 21st century Nye Bevan. The NHS, our most trusted national institution, was forged in the rubble and the poverty of war. It answered a need for treatment that was free at the point of delivery. It has established a template for socialised medicine the world over. To call it a national care service is disingenuous. There has been no suggestion that this will be a socialised model of care. It certainly won't be offered free at the point of delivery. This is a gimmick and a ministerial power grab. As such, Scottish Liberal Democrats stand with the RCN and other stakeholders who believe that these proposals will distract from and delay implementation of other important reforms.
Various green measures, of course, in this year's programme for government. Good timing for that, perhaps, with Scotland hosting the COP26 climate summit in a couple of months, and perhaps showing the influence that those green ministers are already having in terms of power sharing with the SNP and government.
David, some of the fallout from the programme for government that we heard excerpts from rumbled on into First Minister's questions.
That's right. So we heard questions about oil and gas workers and their future. We heard questions about the NHS and how that will get back on its feet after COVID. But that question of a second independence referendum, that was picked up on, and one Labour backbencher certainly wasn't happy with Nicola Sturgeon's plans.
Much of our public services across Scotland are in meltdown. Therefore, how can the First Minister possibly justify using government resources, taxpayers' money, on working up proposals for an independence referendum at a time when surely the whole of the Scottish Government, the whole of this Parliament should be focused on addressing the emergency that we have in our public services?
First Minister. Actually, I don't think we can argue about the impact of UK government austerity on services the length and breadth of Scotland. It has been utterly devastating. And this may be something that Alec Rowley and I just have to disagree on, and he can explain it to his own constituents. But I do think it's right that people in Scotland get the opportunity to choose a different future, to choose a better future, where we take control over social security and how we raise our funds into this Parliament, so we don't have to stand here and, to use his phrase, argue about the impact of another government on people the length and breadth of Scotland.
And MSPs had their say on another important issue, vaccine passports, this week.
Yeah, MSPs have been debating the introduction of vaccine passports. That would mean that to get into a nightclub or another large event, you'd have to show proof of having a double dose of the vaccine. Now, there were many questions remaining about how this would work in practice. For example, what defines a nightclub has yet to be exactly spelled out. How does that differ from a bar? And MSPs got into all these areas when they debated it this week in Holyrood.
I asked a very specific question of the Deputy First Minister, so I'm going to invite an intervention from him. What is a nightclub for the purposes of his vaccine passports?
The circumstances that we face here requires us to more precisely define the distinction to avoid market distortion between nightclubs and venues that could appear similar to nightclubs but have a different purpose. That is the subject of further discussion with the nighttime industry sector to enable us to come to conclusions which will of course be set out in regulations.
And of course, I couldn't forget my old friend Patrick Harvey from the Greens. Before his elevation to the ministerial benches, he used to think that passports would deepen discrimination, would set a dangerous precedent and would create generational injustice. They say a week is a long time in politics. Clearly, it is enough time to jettison your principles.
But above all this, Liberals are fundamentally opposed to vaccine passports on ethical grounds as well. And that is because, and I can't believe I have to say this, you should never have to provide any aspect of your medical history to a bouncer to get into a nightclub.
So the Conservatives worried about the impact on business. Scottish Labour suggesting a better approach could be to ask people to prove they tested negative for COVID before getting into certain venues. We do, after all, know that people who are double vaccinated can still catch and transmit the virus. We heard a bit of criticism from Scottish Labour aimed at the Greens there. A few months ago, the Greens sounded quite cynical about the idea of vaccine passports. They have, of course, since joined the Scottish Government. And Patrick Harvey, their co-leader, hit back, explaining that COVID cases currently in Scotland are so high that something has to be done. And he pointed out that every adult has now had the opportunity in Scotland to get 2 doses of the vaccine. He said, when the facts change, you have to sometimes reassess where you stand. all in all, MSPs did back the idea of vaccine passports in Scotland by 68 votes to 55. SNP and the Greens voted for, the opposition parties voted against. Their use will be reviewed every 3 weeks, and the use of vaccine passports will expire in February 2022 unless MSPs vote to extend their use.
Thank you to David at Holyrood. Now, the Commons returned from its summer recess on Monday, a recess which had been broken, of course, by the recall last month. And they returned to the subject of Afghanistan on Monday, didn't they, Sean?
That's right. The recall was interesting because it's very rare for Parliament to return in August. It was also the first time in almost 18 months that every MP had to be physically present in the Commons. So they were sitting together on the green benches.
Looked full.
It was very, very full. That was quite a heated debate, that recall debate. It was taking place as the Taliban were sweeping into power in Afghanistan and as the evacuation efforts were underway at the airport. There was a lot of criticism then of the United States, and there was a lot of criticism too of ministers here and the way they had reacted to this crisis. The first day back after the summer, Boris Johnson gave a statement on Afghanistan to update MPs. The tone was very different, not least because the Prime Minister was very keen to focus on those things he said the UK should be proud of following its 20-year involvement in Afghanistan.
If anyone is tempted to say that we have achieved nothing in that country, or still tempted to say, Mr. Speaker, that we have achieved nothing in that country in 20 years, tell them that our armed forces and those of our allies enabled 3.6 million girls to go to school. Tell them that this country and the Western world were protected from al-Qaeda in Afghanistan throughout that period. And tell them, Mr. Speaker, that we have just mounted the biggest humanitarian airlift in recent history.
The terrible attacks from ISIS-K highlight the new security threat. The government must act quickly to coordinate international partners to ensure the Afghan government's collapse does not lead to a vacuum for terrorists to fill. And there's a desperate need for humanitarian support. The return to 2019 levels of aid spending is necessary, and where's the plan to ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands?
Veterans and families, indeed the wider public, are asking what was it all for? The country is back in the hands of a dictatorship, terrorism is once again allowed to thrive, and the people of Afghanistan now face humanitarian disaster. More worryingly, the limits of the UK and Western influence have been exposed, and with America now adopting a more isolationist foreign policy, we have passed the high watermark of Western liberalism that began after the Second World War. This is a dangerous geopolitical turning point.
As a result of NATO forces withdrawing from Afghanistan, the terrorist threat has increased. And will he confirm that all those involved in counter-terrorism work here in the UK will be given the necessary support to ensure they can keep us safe?
What steps is he taking in partnership with UK allies to prevent the Taliban and the organised criminal gangs they work with from flooding our communities with yet more heroin, given they are now in control in Afghanistan and have fewer impediments than ever to growing more opium?
Well, the flavour of that debate there, Sean, and of course the government will be hoping very much, as they've said, that the Taliban this time will be different to the Taliban of 20 years ago. And so far, they've ignored calls for recognising the Taliban.
That's right. The government have been very clear that they don't intend to recognise the Taliban at this stage. They'd certainly hoped for what they've described as a more diverse regime in Afghanistan than there is now, and they are looking, in their own words, to see whether the Taliban will honour the pledges that they had made before. So they're going to judge the Taliban on their actions. There's still concern, obviously, about what's going on in Afghanistan, and I don't think Parliament is finished with it yet. There's bound to be inquiries by select committees, and, of course, a lot of MPs are still very concerned because they're still dealing with requests from people who are in Afghanistan who are trying to get out and come to the UK.
All right, well, look, let's go to Northern Ireland, where Assembly members were supposed to be returning next week. We can be joined by our correspondent there, Jane McCormack. They've returned this week instead, haven't they, Jane?
That's right, Joe, and that was due to the problems in schools at the moment around coronavirus. A pretty rocky start to the new term for students and equally for MLAs then who had to come back here, because we've seen as COVID numbers have risen across Northern Ireland generally, that has had an impact in classrooms. We've seen more pupils being listed as close contacts, teachers having to do the bulk of the contact tracing, more pupils missing class because they can't go back in until they have a negative PCR test, and all of this has put real demands onto the testing system. So you can see why then some of the parties here at Stormont would want to point the finger of blame at the DUP's Education Minister, Michelle McIlveen, for this, saying could she perhaps have done more over the summer in terms of contingency planning to make sure that this situation didn't happen. Now, that was the tone of the debate generally on Thursday as MLAs came back here. Michelle McIlveen rejecting all of that, but she did still face some heat from her political opponents.
In many areas, parents were reporting difficulties accessing PCR tests for children, and some families were being directed to testing centres many miles away, making it impossible for those without transport to access a test. Again, with the correct planning and preparation, this could have been avoided. I regret that an Assembly recall was necessary to make this engagement possible, and I believe this is the fourth time a DUP Education Minister has been recalled during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the DUP can present that as a targeting of an Education Minister, or they can take some reflection with regards to the nature of engagement that has taken place.
We learned at this week's Education Committee that the North of Ireland is the only jurisdiction where schools are required to do the contact tracing. Why was that, Minister? Why was principals put in that position to begin with? Everywhere else, it was being done to the PHA. Considering the disruption to learning contact tracing is causing in schools by taking principals and teachers away from education to perform the administration around contact tracing instead of actually teaching, why has it taken so long to act? And again, why was it put there to begin with?
With high rates of the virus currently in the community, both the Department of Health and the Department of Education have recognised that the administrative burden on teachers is not sustainable. It was against this backdrop that my department has agreed with the Department of Health that schools would no longer be required to carry out the PHA's contact tracing work, and only in certain circumstances will a school be asked to assist.
Now, since this crisis began, Joe, officials at Stormont have been working to find a resolution. We now know that from today, the Public Health Agency is going to take over the bulk of contact tracing in schools. That should lift the burden away from principals and school staff in terms of having to do it. But I think there are still questions about whether the Public Health Agency can actually cope with the demand that there is still clearly on the system. And I think even when MLAs do actually return here properly on Monday to start the real term in effect, this is going to rumble on for some time yet.
Right, and it's just one of many issues on the in trays of MLAs.
Yeah, they're coming back from summer with a real bang. Remember that we are going into an election year here at Stormont. The election is due next May, of course, and we didn't have Stormont for 3 years between 2017 and 2020 because of the collapse of power sharing after that row between the DUP and Sinn Féin. So time is short to get through an awful lot of legislation that needs to be resolved before the election. Then throw into the mix this warning yesterday from the DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, who essentially said that if changes aren't made to the Northern Ireland protocol, then within weeks his party will decide whether or not to actually walk away from the power sharing arrangements here. Now, that is a threat he has made to the other parties. I think he's hoping that Boris Johnson and the EU are listening as well. But if the DUP does walk away, that means that power sharing here can't continue, and then it would be over to Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, to have to call an early election.
The election isn't until next May, but as you say, people are already considering it. Are the parties already gearing up and in election mode?
Absolutely. I think the stakes have rarely been higher in an Assembly election. And remember, we had all that turmoil in the DUP with the changes in leadership. That has largely calmed over the summer, but even still, we've had recent polling here. Now, bearing in mind the usual health warnings and caveats that come with those, they've been showing a slump in support for the DUP and a surge for Sinn Féin. And the reason the parties are so interested in that ahead of the election is because the DUP, currently the largest party, they hold the title of First Minister here. If Sinn Féin comes back from the next election with the largest party, then it would take the title of First Minister away from the DUP. And I think not only would that represent a massive shift in our politics here, but also psychologically, potentially a real blow for unionism. Then you've got to throw into the mix, of course, the protocol. We've already talked about it. Unionists here concerned about what's going to happen in 2024. The Assembly is due to get a vote on whether or not to keep the arrangements in place. Now, if unionists want to win that vote, they have to get enough unionist MLAs elected here, something they currently don't have a majority of. So add all of that together and you can see that we're looming towards, I think, a pretty bitter and divisive election campaign, regardless of when it actually happens.
Yeah, it does look like it. Jane and Stormont, thank you very much. Let's talk to Vaughan Roderick. He's at the Senedd in Cardiff. Now, members of the Senedd, Vaughan, aren't actually returning until next week, but what will they be expected to discuss?
Well, they'll be returning, or at least partially returning, next week. It will still be a hybrid session here in the Senedd, reflecting perhaps the more cautious approach to the pandemic in Wales. But there are a lot of issues to get through. We have the knock-ons of some of the things we've been talking about earlier in the programme, the social care national insurance announcement, for instance. What will the Welsh Government be spending that money, that consequential, on? And how will they be delivering social care in Wales? So that's certain to come up. The other issue that I think will be front and centre is one that's developed over the summer, which is the crisis, or apparent crisis, in rural housing availability in parts of Wales, driven by demands for holiday homes, people relocating from the cities. And people in Wales are very, very conscious. The last time the housing market was this white hot in Wales, well, we had 10 years of arson attacks and fire bombings on rural properties. So the government will be under a lot of pressure to come up with some sort of reassurance, some sort of plan that they're going to do something to try and cool down the housing market in the west and the north of Wales, to keep housing available for local people.
And members of the Welsh Parliament will be starting on their programme of legislation in general for the next year. So, Vaughan, what can we expect?
In Scotland, we had the programme of government, the Queen's Speech debate, if you like, back before the summer recess, so they're straight into work. And there are 5 bills going to be presented to the Senedd over the coming year, some of them more controversial than others. The first one that will be up for discussion is the Social Partnerships Bill. Now, this is a bill that the parties to the left in the Senedd, Plaid Cymru and the Labour Party and the solo Lib Dem, are pretty keen on, and which the Conservatives loathe. That it's a bill that will enshrine what's called social partnership. That's giving rights to workers and trades unions, and setting rules around public procurement, meaning that people who supply public services to the Welsh Government have to meet certain standards in terms of pay and conditions and so on. So that's likely to be a controversial bill, but there's no doubt that at the end of the day, the government will have the votes from the other parties to get that bill through and onto the statute book.
Vaughan, thank you for bringing us up to date. Vaughan Roderick there in Cardiff. Let's return to Westminster. Sean, a controversial bill continued its passage through Parliament this week. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, this is a very controversial proposal to change the way people vote in UK parliamentary elections. Ministers want to change the law so that you have to show voter ID when you turn up at the polling station before you're given your ballot paper. They say they're just updating a rather Victorian system, and they insist that their proposals are reasonable and proportionate. The Elections Bill cleared its first big hurdle this week, but not before other MPs had complained that ministers were trying to address a problem that didn't really exist, and they said that they feared these proposals would put people off from taking part in elections.
We are the stewards of a fantastic democratic heritage, and we committed in our manifesto to secure the integrity of elections, restore constitutional balance and defend our democracy against increasingly sophisticated threats. This bill keeps our elections secure, inclusive, fair, transparent and up to date.
Frankly, at a time of a pandemic, it's disappointing that the government is spending time to restrict democracy and not making sure that we've got the support we need for our young people to recover, to deal with the crisis in adult social care. There is so much more that this government, frankly, should be getting on with doing. And instead, we've got this 160-page bill which restricts democracy, that rigs the elections in favour of the Conservative Party, and it is an absolute disgrace.
Government should not, even by accident, put in place electoral legislation that advantages themselves against their opponents. But let's be clear, I mean, only since 2014, only 3 prosecutions, about 30-odd allegations, but about only 3 prosecutions have happened. That's out of many tens of millions of votes cast. So 30-odd allegations, 3 prosecutions, 0 elections outcomes influenced by it. That's the thing we have to bear in mind.
What is the problem they are seeking to solve here? Because seeing a government introduce such radical policy changes without a shred of evidence to support those changes sets alarm bells ringing among those of us who believe that every government should be trying to remove barriers which prevent participation in the democratic process rather than raising them.
Hotly debated, isn't it, this issue, always when it comes up? And what's happening to the bill now?
Well, that was what they call the second reading debate. That's the first big debate on the general principles in the legislation. The government did get its way. There was a vote at the end. Opposition parties did try to stop the bill from going forward, but the government won that vote, which means there'll now be further scrutiny. So there'll be what they call the committee stage. So as the bill goes on, MPs will get the chance, if they want, to propose changes and amendments. So the debate is far from over.
Right. What about expectations of what's happening next week?
It's health and social care again. On Tuesday, the government has cleared the decks and they are going to ask MPs to debate all of the stages of the Health and Care Social Levy Bill in one day. So they're rushing this legislation through Parliament next week, and that, again, will be another opportunity for the same sort of debates that we've had this week about these tax rises.
Right. Is it quite unusual, though, Sean, to sort of rush it through, as some critics will see it, in the way the government has not only presented it, but now is going to go through all the stages of the legislation?
The government argues that there's nothing unusual about this at all, and it's the sort of procedure that you see following a budget, when MPs are often asked to approve things, sometimes on the evening of the budget, so that tax changes can come into force. But, of course, one of the points that people have been raising is there is a long way to go before, first of all, these tax rises will take effect, and also before we see some of the other elements of the policy introduced. So they're certainly being accused by opposition parties of trying to ram their plans through Parliament, and they've been accused of bouncing not just Parliament, but also ministers into approving these plans. So I think there will be more debate about the whole timing and the way the government's handled this when the bill comes forward on Tuesday.
I mean, it is talk, obviously, of a significant tax rise. It won't be long, though, will it, before we have the budget and an all-important spending review?
That's right. The Treasury and the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, are preparing for this. Normally, we would say that the budget is one of the huge events in the parliamentary calendar, and you'd be guaranteed standing room only in the House of Commons. But of course, in a way, this big tax rise has taken some of the attention that would normally be focused on the budget, because obviously the budget is probably going to be less controversial now that you've got this big change already in place.
One of the other changes in this post-COVID world, even though COVID hasn't completely disappeared, is the way Parliament is responding. And Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, encouraging MPs back in the chamber, and we certainly saw that this week. Does it feel and look very different?
I think it does. During the pandemic, there was a very strict limit on the number of people who were allowed in the chamber. A lot of people were taking part via video link, so you didn't get people interrupting ministers in the traditional way. It possibly meant that some ministers didn't get as hard a time when they were at the dispatch box than they would have done in a sort of traditional setting. It certainly feels very different now. We've seen as well a different approach. Opposition MPs still tend to be fairly social distanced, and most of them are wearing face masks. The Conservatives, much closer together when they're on the green benches, and very few of them have decided to keep the face coverings, in spite of the Speaker and other people encouraging people to still follow the guidelines.
And Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, also wants them to smarten up their dress now they're being seen in full, of course, and not just on video link.
Yeah, so no trackies or trainers.
No trackies or trainers, absolutely, and no jeans. That's it from us for today. Thank you to you, Sean. Politics UK will be back next Friday, and I will be back, of course, with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15.